Somewhere off the coast of New Jersey, buried under 230 feet of freezing black water, there's a steel coffin that was never supposed to exist. For half a century, the world believed it was resting near the coast of North Africa, thousands of miles away. Its crew memorialized in the wrong ocean, mourned by families who never knew the real truth. What happened to this vessel, and to the 56 men sealed inside it, is one of the strangest and most chilling naval mysteries ever pulled from the deep. And it all began, not with a historian or a government agency, but with a fisherman whose neck kept snagging on something that should not have been there. It was the early 1990s, and a commercial fishing boat working the waters off the New Jersey coastline kept dragging its nets across the same patch of ocean floor. Every time, the net caught on something solid, something far too large and too regular in shape to be a rock formation or a stray piece of debris. Most captains would have simply avoided the spot and moved on, but this one didn't. He mentioned it to people who spent their lives exploring shipwrecks, and eventually those coordinates landed in front of a wrecked diver named Bill Nagel, a man who had already built a reputation for locating lost vessels along the eastern seaboard that official charts had no record of. Nagel was intrigued immediately because he checked the location against every known shipwreck database available to him, and nothing matched. No merchant vessel, no naval ship, nothing on the books was supposed to be sitting on the seafloor at those exact coordinates. For a man who had spent years mapping the underwater graveyard along the American coast, an unlisted object of significant size was impossible to ignore. He began assembling a team of the most capable technical divers he knew, understanding that whatever was down there sat far beyond recreational diving depth, in a zone where mistakes are almost always fatal. Among the divers he recruited was John Chatterton, a former combat medic turned wreck diver who was already considered one of the most skilled and fearless technical divers on the East Coast. In September of 1991, the dive boat anchored above the unknown coordinates, and the team prepared for a descent into water that offered almost nothing in the way of visibility or warmth. Chatterton went first. As he dropped through the water column, the surface light faded quickly, replaced by a deepening blue, and then, by the time he approached 200 feet, near total darkness. His dive light became his only connection to the world, a narrow cone of visibility swallowed by cold water on every side. When his beam finally struck the ocean floor, it revealed something that stopped him cold. A massive hull rose out of the sand, unmistakably military, unmistakably a submarine, and unmistakably German. The distinct silhouette of the conning tower left little room for doubt. This was a vessel from the Second World War, sitting upright on the seabed as though it had simply been placed there rather than sunk in violence. The hatches appeared sealed. The hull showed no obvious signs of having been torn apart by depth charges or gunfire. It looked, in Chatterton's own later description, disturbingly intact, almost peaceful, which made the situation even more unsettling. A German U-boat, sitting quietly off the coast of New Jersey, was not supposed to be possible. Every wreck of this type had, according to official history, already been accounted for somewhere else in the Atlantic. Chatterton surfaced confused and shaken, describing what he'd seen to the rest of the team. Their first instinct was to do the responsible thing, report it. They contacted the Naval Historical Center and provided every detail they had: the coordinates, the depth, the shape of the conning tower, the layout of the hull. Surely, they thought, an unlisted World War II submarine within sight of the American coastline would trigger immediate interest. Instead, they were told, essentially, that they were mistaken. According to the historical record, every German U-boat lost during the war had a documented fate, a location, a cause, and in most cases a matching Allied action that explained the sinking. Nothing in those records placed a U-boat anywhere near New Jersey. As far as official history was concerned, the wreck the divers had touched with their own hands simply did not exist. This left the team in an impossible position. They had physical, undeniable proof in front of them, a genuine World War II U-boat resting on the ocean floor, yet the paperwork insisted it could not be there. It is one thing to be told your eyes deceived you about something small. It is another to be told that an 80-meter steel submarine you swam around and touched is a historical impossibility. Some divers wondered if they had simply misidentified the wreck, mistaken it for something else. But the design was too specific, Too clearly the work of a wartime German shipyard, to be confused with anything else resting in those waters. To understand how strange this discrepancy really was, you have to understand what kind of vessel this actually turned out to be. It was identified as a Type 9C/40 U-boat, a long-range attack submarine built for extended patrols far from home waters. It had been constructed in Bremen and commissioned in early 1944, during a phase of the war when Germany was pouring resources into submarines capable of reaching distant, previously untouched shipping lanes along the American coast. Its commanding officer, a young officer only in his late 20s, had already served aboard other U-boats and understood exactly how dangerous the Atlantic had become for the German submarine fleet by that point in the war. 56 men called this vessel home for what was meant to be a combat patrol lasting months. Some were seasoned sailors who had survived previous missions and knew the terrifying rhythm of life underwater, the claustrophobia, the constant threat of detection, the discipline required simply to keep the boat functioning. Others were barely out of their teens, freshly trained, and thrown almost immediately into one of the most lethal branches of military service in the entire war. Inside the hull, there was no room for hesitation. Every man had a defined role, whether operating the diesel engines, managing the torpedo tubes, or plotting a course through waters patrolled by an enemy with increasingly sophisticated detection technology. Earlier in the war, German submarines had dominated the Atlantic using coordinated pack tactics, striking at Allied convoys under cover of darkness and disappearing before retaliation could arrive. For a period, this strategy devastated Allied shipping and threatened to cut off critical supply lines to Britain and beyond. But by the time this particular submarine set out on its final patrol, the balance of power beneath the waves had shifted dramatically. Allied forces had developed radar capable of detecting a surfaced submarine from the air, sonar that could track a submerged hull, and long-range patrol aircraft that dropped depth charges the moment a target was suspected. Perhaps most devastating of all, Allied codebreakers had cracked German naval communications, meaning that in many cases, the hunters already knew where their prey was heading before the submarine itself even reached its patrol zone. The result was catastrophic for the German submarine service. Of the roughly 40,000 men who served aboard U-boats throughout the war, close to 30,000 never came home, a mortality rate so severe it remains one of the highest of any military branch in modern history. By late 1944, being assigned to a U-boat patrol was, for many young sailors, understood almost as a death sentence dressed up as a mission. This particular submarine departed from a Norwegian port in November of 1944, its orders directing it across the Atlantic toward the shipping lanes near New York and New Jersey. An aggressive and dangerous assignment, given how thoroughly the Allies had come to dominate those waters. It crossed the North Sea, pushed into the open Atlantic, and for a time maintained periodic radio contact with command. Then, without warning, the transmission stopped. Silence was not unusual for a submarine attempting to avoid detection, so at first, no alarm was raised. It was only after the war that officials began trying to account for every lost vessel, cross-referencing Allied attack reports with the last known positions of German submarines. An Allied engagement recorded off the coast of North Africa, near Gibraltar, in the final weeks of the war seemed to match the profile of this missing U-boat closely enough that officials on both sides accepted it as the answer. The case was closed. Records were updated. Families were informed that their sons, husbands, and brothers had been lost in the waters near Africa. Memorials were built with that location engraved into them. For nearly 50 years, that was simply understood to be the truth. Except it wasn't. The real vessel had been sitting the entire time off the coast of New Jersey, roughly 5,000 miles from where the history books insisted it went down. Diving on this wreck was never going to be simple curiosity. At a depth of 230 feet, the ocean stops being forgiving almost immediately. The cold hits within moments of descent, water temperatures near freezing sap heat from the body, far faster than most divers expect, and currents at that depth can shift suddenly, pulling a diver away from their guideline before they even realize what's happening. Visibility is often measured in a few feet at best, and the moment a diver disturbs the silt that has settled inside the wreck for decades, that visibility can collapse to nothing in seconds. Then there is nitrogen narcosis, a strange and dangerous side effect of breathing compressed air at extreme depth. Divers describe it as a kind of intoxication, a fog that settles over judgment and decision-making exactly when clear thinking matters most, combined with the accelerated air consumption that comes with depth, where a single tank might last only a fraction of the time it would at the surface. Every dive on this wreck carried the very real possibility of never coming back up. Entering the interior added another layer of danger entirely. A maze of narrow, twisted compartments filled with sharp broken metal, collapsed equipment, and sediment that could turn a dive into a blind, disorienting nightmare in an instant. Despite all of this, the divers kept returning, driven by a mystery that refused to let them go. Because the wreck carried no visible identification, no nameplate, no obvious serial number anywhere accessible, they began referring to it simply as the mystery boat. Every theory floated by the team only deepened the puzzle. Had identifying marks been deliberately removed? Had the crew stripped the vessel of anything traceable before its final moments? No one could say for certain, and that uncertainty became its own kind of obsession. That obsession came at a devastating cost. In October of 1992, an experienced father and son diving team descended to the wreck together. Something went wrong at depth, whether from staying too long, pushing too far into the structure, or a combination of complications that likely compounded quickly in that environment. Both men lost consciousness before they could be brought to the surface, and neither survived. It was a brutal reminder of exactly how dangerous this site truly was. Yet even after that tragedy, the diving continued, and later, another diver would also lose his life pursuing answers about this same wreck. 3 deaths in total would eventually be tied to the search for the truth about this one submarine, a toll that sparked genuine debate within the diving community about whether the mystery was worth the price being paid to solve it. While divers debated whether to continue, others focused on a different question entirely. If this submarine hadn't been sunk in an Allied attack near Africa, then what actually destroyed the real one here, off the American coast? Careful examination of the hull damage told a very different story than the one in the official record. The most severe destruction was concentrated around the control room, the operational heart of the vessel where commands were issued and the boat was steered and coordinated. But the pattern of that damage didn't match what depth charges typically produced. Depth charge damage tends to be broad, distributed, and inward crushing from external water pressure across a wide section of hull. What investigators found instead was damage torn inward from a single, concentrated point, consistent with an internal explosion or a direct hit from something fired at extremely close range, not a charge detonating somewhere out in the surrounding water. No Allied records from that period and location described an attack on a submarine anywhere near the New Jersey coast. If a kill of this significance had actually happened there, it would have been logged, celebrated, and credited to whichever ship or aircraft crew had accomplished it. There was nothing. That absence, combined with the unusual, concentrated nature of the damage, pointed toward a chilling and almost unthinkable possibility that the submarine had been destroyed not by an enemy weapon, but by one of its own. German submarines of this era were equipped with acoustic homing torpedoes, weapons designed to lock onto the sound signature of an engine and track their target automatically once launched. It was advanced technology for its time, but it carried a fatal design flaw. If the torpedo failed to properly acquire its intended target, it could instead lock onto the loudest nearby sound source available, and in the open ocean, that source was very often the very submarine that had just fired it. Picture the moment. Deep in the cold Atlantic, the crew executes a torpedo launch, expecting the distant thud of an explosion against an enemy vessel somewhere ahead. Instead, the torpedo loses its lock on the intended target and begins curving back toward the loudest engine noise in water, which is its own boat's diesel engines. There would have been no warning system capable of detecting this kind of failure in real time. The weapon closed in silently and detonated directly against the hull near the control room. The explosion would have torn the compartment open in an instant, flooding it and killing everyone stationed there almost immediately, likely before they had any understanding of what had happened. But a submarine of this design was built with separate, sealable compartments specifically to survive partial flooding. Crew members further back in the vessel, in the engine room and other rear sections, would have survived that initial blast. They would have felt the shockwave, heard the terrifying rush of water flooding the forward compartments, and understood, almost immediately, that their boat was dying around them. Training would have kicked in, watertight doors sealed. For a brief window, the surviving crew may have believed there was still a chance, that the flooding could be contained, that the boat might somehow stabilize. But the damage was too severe. The submarine lost buoyancy control and began a slow, uncontrollable descent toward the ocean floor, dragging its surviving crew down into total darkness as electrical systems failed one by one. Whatever